There's so much writing advice in the world that it is easy to get lost in the sauce. You come to YouTube, you've learned content writing, you've learned creative writing, you've learned how to structure your story. All those things sometimes can actually stop you from writing. So I have some gentle reminders for myself when I'm writing. The first thing I do when I sit down to write is I remind myself that I am worthy. I remind myself that what I'm writing is important, that there are people in the world that need my stories. There are people in the world that connect with what I'm writing. It's so easy to become discouraged because there will always be a writer better than you. There's some people you read that you just want to rip out your notebook. You don't ever want to write again. So you have to remind yourself that your story is equally important. There's something I learned the hard way. Writing rules can actually stop you from writing. I've seen so many instances where writers complain, oh, my story doesn't have conflict. Doesn't mean it's not a good story. Or my story doesn't have the three-act structure. Doesn't mean it's not a great story. Formulas don't necessarily make stories great. Yeah, they are good for giving you structure, but don't let that stop you from writing. If your story doesn't have conflict or if your story doesn't have an antagonist, it doesn't make it a terrible story. You have to accept the fact that some people just want to enjoy stories. People want to watch films for the fun of it. One of my sisters, if a story doesn't have a happy ending, she is not reading that story. She is not watching that film. There are people in the world that just want to watch things for fun. They just want to have a good time. They just want to unwind. And they're not worried about suspense or you can just write that story for enjoyment. As a multi genre writer, one of the decisions that made my life easy was allocating each day to a writing task. So I've spoken about this in a previous video. I have days where I'm working on nonfiction. I have days where I'm working on poetry. I have days where I'm working on short stories and scripts. That helps me to do what I call project based learning. So if I need to brush up on my skills, I don't have to just randomly do things. If I'm working on creative nonfiction, I know the writers I want to read that morning before I sit down to do my task. If I'm working on script, maybe there's a film that I love the structure, I love the dialogue, I can quickly watch a scene or two just to pick up some cues from it to use as a guide when I'm working on my scripts. You're probably tired of hearing this, but you have to learn to write for yourself. I've come to accept that not everything I write I'll put out. Some things are personal, some things are for my enjoyment. And then there are some things that I know that maybe they are not the trend or it's not the cool thing to write or maybe it's too vulnerable. But I write it anyways because it's something I would want to read. Toni Morrison once said, if there is a book you want to read and it is not yet written, then you must write it yourself. Story time. So there was a time a young poet sent me a DM on Instagram. He wanted me to give him feedback on some poems. And I said, okay, send them my way. I went through the poems and I felt like it needed a lot of work. So I sent him some poets I felt would align with his style of writing, just to guide him on his journey. And he wrote back to me and said, oh, I don't read poets. I don't want them to influence my writing. That is literally the worst thing you can do to yourself as a writer. If you want to be a brilliant writer, you have to read a lot. In fact, I think you should have days where you're just reading. And outside books on writing, read fiction, read poetry, read journals, read magazines, read anything you can find. In fact, read the ads on on bottles. Read everything you can read. There's so much inspiration in the words of other people. I don't know if you can tell, but I really love music. And if you're like me, you've created playlists for your writing days. When I'm editing poetry, I love to listen to rap, especially Kendrick Lamar. I think the musicality of poetry and rap just, you know. I have jazz playlists for when I'm writing short stories, and I have just instrumentals for when I'm working on scripts. So just find your rhythm, find what works for you. But music really helps with the writing process. If you like this video, please kindly subscribe, like, and share.